Welcome to JCATS, a program that seeks to introduce Japanese contextualized literature and ideas for use by missionaries and anyone that seeks to share the gospel with Japanese people.
日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教。
Hey, welcome back. Here with Kai again. And last time we talked about the Kumamoto Band of Christians in early Protestant history. Before that, we talked about just a quick sketch between Francis Xavier and Commodore Perry's gunboat diplomacy, and into the Yokohama Band, where the very first Protestant church for Japanese people popped up in Yokohama. And Kai, if I can remember just my super basic impressions, the Yokohama Band came from in a sense, missionaries from the old Princeton tradition, which would be sort of Calvinistic, traditionally evangelical, which that word is going to just be older than the way we use it about American evangelicalism today. And also that tradition tried to avoid denominationalism. Those are my major impressions there. And then we talked about the Kumamoto Band last episode. And that tradition, let's see, we had the original teacher who was James, right?
Yes, Lansing James.
And he taught people ethics, Christianity through ethics. And we had a number of people commit themselves, which would be what we would call the beginning of the Kumamoto Band. You said it was 34? 34 young people?
Young people, so mostly teenagers, some as young as 12 years old.
Right, and they committed themselves to Christianity and in a sort of a mind of how that could improve the nation as well. And then many of them became students with Doshisha, which is today a university, but at the time that was a Christian training school.
Sure. Or it had just been started as what is now known as the mission school, started by Nishima Jo, to teach education founded on Christianity.
Okay, and then you had also mentioned, I think, that we had the Kyokai-ha and the Shakai-ha were somewhat characteristic of each of those two bands.
Kyokai-ha and Shakai-ha are used with reference to some Protestants in Japan today.
Oh.
But to an extent, you can see the roots of that of those two streams, even at this time, with the emphasis on the church being more characteristic of those from the Yokohama Band, such as Masahisa Uemura, and the emphasis on various forms of social activism within some of those who came out of the Kumamoto Band.
All right. And then finally there was some influence from a group of German missionaries in the Kumamoto Band for something that would be maybe more what we would call classical liberal theology, which emphasized sort of some of the traditional maybe pillars of Christianity, the divinity of Christ and things like that.
Or would have a different understanding of those.
Yeah, please shape that the way you feel is most accurate. Okay, so and we talked. We had there was a number of fascinating people in that Kumamoto group. But then today or this episode, we're thinking to move on to the Sapporo Band.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know very little about that, so
Yeah, so the third of the three major bands is the Sapporo Band. So we talked about the Yokohama Band starting in 1872 when nine people who had been learning from the missionaries in Yokohama confessed Christian faith, and who, along with two others who had earlier been baptized, became part of the Yokohama Kokai, the first church, a Protestant Japanese church. Then 4 years later, in 1876, 34 students at Kumamoto Western School professed their conversion to Christianity, becoming the Kumamoto Band. The next one is the Sapporo Band. Similarly to the Kumamoto Band, the start of the Sapporo Band is through a school and through a foreign lay educator who was a Christian. In this case, William Clark. William Clark, we talked about the Yokohama Band, we talked about James Hepburn, and how his name is one with which most Japanese people will be familiar, even if only as the Hebon, who made Hebon Shiki, the standard system of Romaji that's used for writing translating Japanese into the Roman alphabet. William Clark is also a well-known name. One of the, if you see any pamphlet for tourism in Sapporo, in Hokkaido, you'll probably see the statue of William Clark pointing. And many Japanese people will be familiar with the quote, "Boys, be ambitious," which is from a speech that William Clark gave near the end of his time, even though it was only 8 months that he was teaching in Sapporo, a speech he gave at the end of that time. He was a committed Christian. Actually, within that speech, it seems that he not only said, "Boys, be ambitious," but "Boys, be ambitious in Christ" is the full quote. It seems that he said it repeatedly within the speech. Sometimes just "Boys, be ambitious," but also "Boys, be ambitious in Christ," which is the full quote and is the context for saying "Boys, be ambitious" throughout the speech.
yeah, I've definitely heard that quote before in a church context. I don't remember where.
You'll hear it outside of church context, outside of Christian context in Japan. Many people are not familiar with its specifically the Christian context of its original use by Clark. Again, at this time in Japanese history, Japan wanted to, or saw education for people throughout society, commoners, as people who had been commoners before as well, learning, and also for knowledge to be sought throughout the world for the strengthening of Japan and modernization of Japan. That happened in places like Yokohama and in Kumamoto, but also in Sapporo. Now, Sapporo is a little bit different context from Yokohama or Kumamoto, in that Sapporo was just starting to be developed. It wasn't the large city that it is today. Hokkaido had, Japan had made the decisive statement of Ezo, was the former name of Hokkaido, being part of Japan, and wanted to develop Hokkaido for a couple of reasons. One of them was its agricultural potential. Even if you go to a grocery store today, of course, you'll see milk from Hokkaido or other food from Hokkaido. Hokkaido has a reputation for its good food. Lots of agriculture there. Another reason was concern with aggression from Russia. So in 1875, there was an agreement between Japan and Russia concerning who gets what. Japan had already made wanted to develop Hokkaido in the north, partly in protection from potential aggression from Russia. But at the agreement with Russia in 1875, Sakhalin goes to Russia, and the northern territories, or Kuril Islands, belong to Japan. So that continues to be the political issue today, where the northern territories, the Kuril Islands, are considered part of Japan by Japan, but are controlled by Russia.
Those are the islands that sort of flare up north of Hokkaido,
Yes.
is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Another factor we won't really get into today while talking about the Sapporo Band is the effect that this had on the Ainu. Ainu were living both in Sakhalin and also in Hokkaido. And now you have two nation states. The Ainu didn't have their own nation states. That was different from their this structure of their or their social structure. And now you have two nation states, Russia and Japan, making decisions about what land belongs to which country.
In the middle, you have the indigenous people
Yes.
that I knew.
Yes. Anyway, these are all factors contributing to the desire to develop Hokkaido. And as part of it, education and to encourage agriculture and settlement by Japanese, increase of settlement by Japanese in Hokkaido. There was the Sapporo Agricultural College was started. Its roots are a little bit further back, but really starts as Sapporo Agricultural College in 1875. William Clark, who had been teaching agriculture in the U.S., was brought over to teach there. He was a Christian and made what was called the Yasuo Shinzuru Mono no Keiyaku, or the covenant of those who believe in Jesus, which students in his first class there signed. It included basic statements about Christian faith and Christian lifestyle. Clark was only there for eight months and then returned to the U.S. A new group of students came in, and those students who had confessed Christianity under Clark put pressure on the incoming students that they would also sign this covenant. Some of them did so. Others felt uncomfortable, felt they were being pressured by their upperclassmen, but you can't...
Who's to say, right?
Was not really in a position where they could comfortably refuse either. One of those was Uchimura Kanzo, who felt uncomfortable with the way he was being pressured at the time, but then shortly after converted to Christianity from the point of his own personal faith and became a leader within Japanese Christianity.
Sure.
So again, similar to the Kumamoto Band, the beginning of the Sapporo Band is not in a church, but in an educational setting from a foreign educator. But in contrast to the Kumamoto Band, where Christianity was introduced through the study of ethics, there was a statement of basic statements of Christian faith, as well as a Christian lifestyle that they were introduced to from the beginning through this covenant.
Do you know the the church background for Clark?
I've forgotten it at the right now. I'd have to look it up again.
It's interesting he would do like a covenant, but I don't know if that's just my modern, when I thinking through categories, covenant becomes an important word for certain
Yes, and
groups
it's
more than
and in Japanese it's keihaku, which is both covenant and contract.
Yeah.
You don't have that distinction. That's when you read about it in English, it's usually translated as covenant.
Covenant. Okay.
But the word in Japanese is keihaku.
Keihaku, yeah.
So.
Sure. So I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine. So, again, as in the other context, you have a group of students, a group of young people who confess Christianity and became leaders in Japanese Christianity and in Japanese society following that. Again, not at first connected to a church, but after the confession of Christianity, they received baptism from a Methodist missionary who was in Sapporo. Two of the major figures from this period are Uchimura, or from the Sapporo Band, are Uchimura Kanzo, who became known as the founder of the Mukyokai, or non-church movement, and Nitobe Inazo. I think some of the listeners will be familiar with the book Bushido. He's the author of the book Bushido, and also he used to be on the 5,000 yen bill. So another well-known figure in Japanese society, not as a leader in Japanese Christianity in the sense of a pastor, but one who was involved in especially in American-Japanese relations, and also a significant intellectual and educator as well. He would later teach at Sapporo Agricultural College.
Okay. Yeah. So those two figures, Uchimura and
Nitobe Inazo.
Inazo. Both of them would be interesting figures for missionaries today. I feel like I've heard cases where missionaries wanted to make use of the materials that flow from both of those guys. I might be jumping ahead in our conversation to ask about your thoughts about the usefulness of Uchimura's work for missionaries in contextualization today, or Inazo's work with Bushido. I know that both are going to probably be dealing with Confucianist ideas, and I don't have probably enough to recommend or not recommend how much to tinker with there. But yeah, I may be jumping ahead of our conversation when we talk about that. So I feel like we know Uchimura because he just wrote so much, or maybe because he was fairly influential in Japan. Maybe both. And then we know the boys be ambitious thing. I hear that from missionaries. I hear that, here and there. What do you think is maybe the most influential thing about the Sapporo Band for the church? How that shaped the church moving forward, whether it was because of the influence of certain people within the Sapporo Band or something else. And then maybe after that, if I could get some of your thoughts, maybe on how we could interact today with Uchimura, Kanzo, or Inazo with some of their work.
Yeah. Just a quick point, quickly on the last point, in anticipation of what can develop more later on. I think both Uchimura, Kanzo, and Nitobe Inazo are sometimes attractive for non-Japanese trying to study Japanese Christianity, especially thinking about the context of Christianity, because they think, or they perceive these two thinkers as having a very Japanese Christianity. Where we need to be careful with that is in recognizing that they're not representative of all Japanese Christians, even at their own time. Again, we've talked about the Yokohama Band, we've talked about the Kumamoto Band, we've talking about the Sapporo Band. There are other smaller bands too. These are the ways that they're at their writing. In their writings, you can see their own understanding and appropriation and application of Christianity, but you can't generalize that as, oh, this is Japanese Christianity. And others like those in the Yokohama Band and Kumamoto, as though those from the Yokohama Band or the Kumamoto Band are less Japanese. Another question, so that's what, they're not a representative of Christians at that time. Also, both of them are writing very consciously from their backgrounds of former samurai, of, in the case of Uchimura Kanzo, wanting to draft Christianity onto Bushido. In the case of Nitobe Inazo's writing of the book Bushido, that was to explain Japanese morality to foreigners.
Okay.
And in order to do that, he was writing from his own background, and he did it according to explaining it within the foreign context of Victorianism at that time.
Okay, so the Bushido was trying to explain Confucianist samurai ideas to Victorian Westerners?
Yes.
Kind of how?
Yes.
Okay.
But even within Japan, he's writing, they're both coming from the background of the elite.
Okay.
So socially, they're not representative of all of Japan. Even within Christianity at the time, they were not representative of all Christianity in Japan. And then the other factor of this is the 1870s when the Sapporo Band started. Now it's in the 2020s, and all of the changes that have occurred between that time and this time, including major changes in Japanese society.
Yeah, because I feel like when I hear about ideas that maybe other missionaries or other Westerners like myself have about contextualizing or listening to Japanese voices, I feel like Kanzo Uchimura comes up first, and then obviously Bushido is a big idea. And I kind of think that, I suspect that part of that is because for Westerners, it's most natural to look at the thing that's going to look the most different to us. So in our minds, samurai is where we're going to jump right to the thing that's most visible, right? So Uchimura Kanzo, being the former samurai turned Christian, is the thing. And I want to say I read an article about that it sort of asked people to pause on that idea It was by I'm blanking on his name. It's the guy that was at ICU for a long time that we've talked about in the past. Morimoto Andi had an article about. I think it was just asking people to sort of hit the brakes a bit on exoticism.
Yes.
So, like, just because it looks the most foreign to you doesn't mean it's the most Japanese to us.
Right.
You might be talking about Japan 100 years ago. I guess it kind of could really easily be explained by the idea that a Japanese person might think of a piano as a Japanese instrument, whereas a Western person hears Japanese instrument and says koto or shamisen, or baseball. A Japanese person wouldn't necessarily think of baseball as a foreign thing. They might say, well, we do it the way we do it. Putting it directly in my context, because I love baseball, and I'm probably pulling us way off track. But yeah, I thought that's interesting when we talk about the Sapporo Band, because it's not like a trap, but it's maybe low-hanging fruit in a sense for Westerners to try and grab at when we want to contextualize.
Yeah, in a way, it's something that can be attractive to connect to for a foreigner through the stereotype of Japan samurai.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the samurai system ended in the 1860s.
Right. Well, it's such
If you were to think of an analogy from the U.S., for example, the 1860s is time of the Civil War. Now, there are still things from the era of the Civil War that shaped what the U.S. is today, but you can't just take one thing from the Civil War era, one person's thought from that time, and say, oh, this is what America is. This is the way that we have to these are the ideas that we have to appropriate and apply when doing ministry in American context today.
Yeah. Well, that totally
and also
makes
recognizing
sense.
the diversity at the time of Civil War. I mean, there was so much diversity in American thought at the time that there was a Civil War.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really good stuff. So, I think one of the things that I was really looking forward to was the application of this long and yet very short, right, sort of summary of that early first generation of Japanese Protestant Christianity. We talked about the three major bands of Yokohama, Kumamoto, Sapporo, and you mentioned that there were others. Those are just the sort of three largest or best known, perhaps. And I was curious to hear from you what you thought, like, as missionaries. And again, there's been a lot of time from then until now. And we probably could talk more about the history in between then and now to better understand how we can deal with things as missionaries. In fact, I'd love to do that when we have time. But what do you, if we could get a kind of a quick takeaway? We've talked about these three things, so it's like, now what? For missionaries specifically, what do we take from these people, and how does that help us to better think about Japan, the church in Japan, and better reach Japanese people, and better kind of renew within ourselves a way to bridge things from us in our own understanding and with the church in Japan. So, if that makes sense.
Yeah. If I may start answering that by saying a little bit more about the Sapporo Band. because it relates to the interaction with missionaries. As you continue on, I've talked right about the beginning of the Sapporo Band, but continuing on from that, some of those from the Sapporo Band, again, they'd been baptized by a Methodist missionary. Then they tried to start their own independent church, but some were rather turned off by the missionaries that they interacted with in Sapporo. I think there was a more collegial work among missionaries in when the Yokohama Band started, but some of those within the Sapporo Band saw conflicts among missionaries from different denominations, and also became disillusioned with some of the larger mission organization structure, denominational structure. Part of that, again, is probably the early contact with the Methodist missionary, which has a larger structure than, say, the congregational background of some of those from within the Kumamoto Band, or in the case of the Yokohama Band, even though the missionaries there were from different denominations, they made the deliberate effort not to import denominational fragmentation. And for some of those, there was an appeal to what we might even consider the low end of low church, meaning in the contrast of high church and low church. For both Uchimura Kanzo and Nitobe Inazo. Nitobe Inazo eventually became a Quaker. Uchimura Kanzo also studied in the U.S. After that, where he also spent time with the Quakers. Inazo married an American, a Quaker, and then came back to Japan. The emphasis in what they'd observed in Quaker churches in the U.S. was very plain, very simple church buildings, not the larger denominational organization and structure. Also, in emphasis on individual faith and prayer. I think Quaker, there's a concept of the inner light. For Uchimura, he paired that with rigorous study of the Bible. So among his extensive writing, lots of writing on the Bible. His commentary on Romans continues to be used by many Japanese believers today. But there was, especially in the case of Uchimura, a reaction against the conflicts among missionaries, among denominations, and a desire for this very simple, in some ways individualistic, Christianity. So we can see different ways that were appropriated in these different contexts. As far as what we can learn, thinking about back over all three of these bands. For one thing, just studying these as a very important part of Japanese Protestant history. And through that study, understanding why somewhat has helped to form Protestantism in Japan as it is today. Again, I mentioned the American Civil War a little bit ago as an analogy. If you want to understand America as it is today, you have to study American history. And that will include what happened 150, 160 years ago, including the Civil War. Even if the situation of America right now is not what it was then. And the same thing in the same way, if you want to understand Japanese Protestantism today, it's important to study its history. What are factors that formed, that contributed to forming what it is today? Now, that will include study of what's happened in that time in between, but it's important to study what happened at this time. So just generally, as far as for understanding why Protestant Japan is what it is today, and understanding what the different streams within it are, what the different influences are, what the backgrounds were of some of the influential leaders in the years that followed. More practically, I think you can see different aspects of the Christian faith that tended to be and Christian living that were that we can see emphasized in each of these bands. So on the one hand, you have emphasis on ethics, on social reform, for example, in the Kumamoto Band, the emphasis on church evangelism in the Yokohama Band, this emphasis on individual faith to an extent in the Sapporo Band. Even though among all of them you can see this desire in the context of the time of Christianity being the desire for Christianity to help to be for the good of Japan as a whole. If we bring all of those together, a reminder of the Christian faith for all of life, and not separated into one category, which can sometimes be the way in which religion can be thought of in various contexts, whether an American context or a Japanese context or a context in another country. If you take Christianity as comprehensive, it does have both its individualistic elements, but it also is something that has implications for how one interacts with society, has implications for ethics, has implications for the church. Sometimes I saw an interesting results of a survey the other day, surveying people from many different countries on the question of, is religion for life after death, or is religion for this life?
Sure.
And one thing that was notable is that Japan was all the way on one side, specifically all the way on the religion is for this life side. And understanding religion as something that connects with your lifestyle. Now, sometimes in a Japanese context, I think that can be understood within a framework of a corporate relativism, where maybe the religion that somebody adheres to is one among other religions, and there's a chosen lifestyle that goes with it. But there's expectation or perception among many. If there's a Christian, there's a certain lifestyle that goes with that. If Christianity is just taught as in a very individualistic way, that is concerned with only life after death, there's a gap there. I think there's a gap between that presentation of Christianity and what we see in the New Testament as well.
And that's your specialty, in a sense. It's here. The New Testament is.
New Testament is yes.
You're an authority.
I certainly
on
have
the New
interest
Testament.
in Japanese Christian history. The main area of my my research is New Testament studies. But
you actually teach classes in both
Yes.
topics. Yeah.
Another point would be, along with that, faith in relationship to others, which can be a check on a strong individualistic emphasis. Each of these bands were groups of people, groups of young people who learned about Christianity together, and as much as individuals, there was an acceptance of Christian faith. They did that along with others. Even as so, for example, for Christian missionaries who may be listening, you can think for yourself how you came to a Christian faith. It was in relationship to other people.
Yep.
Whether you heard about Christianity from your family, or through visiting a church, or in some other, from a Christian friend. In the example of these three bands, we can see not only learning from whether missionaries in the case of the Yokohama Band, or from Christian lay people in the case of the Sapporo Band or the Kumamoto Band, in that relationship to another person, but then also as a group. Another thing I think we can see is the significance of young people. These were young students, many of them, especially in the case of the Kumamoto Band, most of them being between 12 to 19 years old. And these became leaders in Japanese Christianity, leaders in society, including government and social reform, work as public intellectuals, corrective voice toward government. There are various examples of their work that changed, or their impact on society in Japan as a whole.
Yeah. So, so in my brain, it almost sounds like, again, I feel like I'm oversimplifying every single thing here, but in my brain, we have these three bands, and when you mention, there's sort of things that each band emphasizes, but we could do well to try to remember each of them. It almost sounded like in the Yokohama Band, the relationship with God could have been thought of as emphasized. In the Kumamoto Band, maybe a relationship with neighbor, or a social ethics and social work could have been emphasized. And then I could be saying this in a weird way, but it almost feels like in the Sapporo Band you had almost like relationship with self, or maybe what God does in you, like with the kind of work with the Quakers and things like that. And it sounds to me like you could make a case that all three of those are important, shouldn't be neglected. We want to have a relationship with God, and we don't want that to end at a relationship with God. We want that to influence the world and our community, and we also want that to change us. That might just be a really, really Western way of summarizing those, but if you could maybe like kind of adjust what I've thrown up there.
Yeah. One thing maybe to add on to that, in the case of the Yokohama Band, is the relationship with the church as well, especially that emphasis on the church in the case of the Yokohama Band.
Okay, yeah.
So, and I think each of them would have thought in terms of a relationship to God, although, for example, in the case of Ebina Danjo in the Kumamoto Band, that was understood from his background in Confucianism as
you kind of father-son.
Through the framework of the principle of filial piety. Now, the father-son aspect is one that certainly is in the New Testament, and it's important to think about how that's appropriated. That's something that Ebina Danjo was able to connect with because of his background. But I think all of them would have understood relationship with God as a very important, foundationally. But in the case of the Yokohama Band, adding that relationship to church as a significant element for them.
Awesome. Yeah. So, are there any resources you would recommend, either writings from anyone in these bands, or Nishima, or books that maybe detail some of this stuff? I know that you had to sift through a lot of material to get to the point where you could summarize. I did it again. Summarize this amount of material for us in these just couple of episodes for this podcast, which I think is really awesome. But any suggested reading or viewing or anything?
So, just for a very simple and accessible introduction, one book I can recommend, and you have your copy open here, following along with some of the things that I've talked about, is this book, A History of Japanese Theology, edited by Yasuo Furuya, formerly a professor at International Christian University. This is a short book, with the effort of, if you read the introduction, it says this is for Japanese people to say for themselves what Japanese history of Japanese theology is to people outside of Japan, rather than just having people outside of Japan write about what their perceptions of the history of Japanese theology is. So there can often be quite a bit of a gap between those two perceptions. This is just as a very introduction. It's about 140, 150 pages, and there's one chapter in there on the first generation, which talks about some of the major figures from each of these three bands.
Yeah, I like that one. I read that too before talking with you, and this conversation filled in a lot of the blanks. So yeah, I had kind of heard of some of the arguments or thoughts of some of these people, but definitely a lot more going on from our conversation.
For other resources available in English, I'd highly recommend, not just for this period, but to gain a larger understanding of the history of Japanese Christianity. From the Sengoku period all the way to the post-war period, would be the 4 volumes edited by Mark Mullins, published by Brit-El, Critical Readings in the History of Japanese Christianity. They're expensive. It's 4 volumes, expensive, but if you have access to an academic library, or seminary library, you may have access to them. I highly recommend. If I had my way, every missionary would read through all 4 of those volumes before arriving in Japan. I think this really helped in giving an understanding of just a basic foundational understanding of Christianity in Japan. And then, of course, you can read about each of the individuals mentioned, both missionaries, foreign educators associated with each of the bands, as well as the writings of the members of each of the bands. Now, in the case of the members of each of the bands, much of that will be written in Japanese. Those who are able to read Japanese certainly get what is available to you. Read the works of Uemura. Read the works of Uchimura and others. For those who are, but at the same, also read what's available in English. Some things, for example, Nitobe Inazo wrote a Bushido in English. Now, remember the context of it when you read it. He's understanding from his own perspective, and somewhat an elitist perspective, in the 1800s to explain his perception of morality for samurai, which was a system that had just recently ended, to people in a Victorian context. So you have to remember in that that it's in that context, but but as part of gaining a well-rounded understanding, it's important to read that work by him as well, which was originally written in English. Also other figures such as James Curtis Hepburn. There's a biography about him by Griffiths, another missionary who came to work with him a little bit later, called Hepburn of Japan and His Wife and Helpmeets. It was published in 1913 by Westminster John Knox. 1913 now is in the public domain, so you can get it. You can read it free online from archive.org or probably from other websites, which is a very interesting book to read to learn about James Hepburn. Just talked about him a little bit.
He was in the Yokohama Band section, right?
So yes, he is one of the first Protestant missionaries to arrive in Japan, and was some of the things we didn't talk about in the podcast is he was involved in the translation of the Bible into Japanese. In addition to having a clinic where he taught Christianity to any who wanted to learn. Being involved, of course, in helping the Yokohama Kokai, the first Japanese Protestant church to start, and then later on the Shiro Kyokai, another Japanese church, which is still in Yokohama till today. And then his work in linguistics, developing Romaji, also writing what became the standard English-Japanese dictionary until the period of the war, or until the 1930s.
Okay.
Also introducing a lot of medical science to Japan, even modern soap manufacturing, and so on. So, major figure. He received an award from the Emperor. And then his wife was a pioneer of women's education in Japan. So fascinating to read the biography of him by Griffiths. Hepburn of Japan and His Wife and Helpmeets.
How do you spell the author's name?
Griffis. Griffiths.
Just like you said. Okay, well, that's a lot of good stuff, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share it with us. The three major bands, because you mentioned there were smaller bands here and there, such as Nagasaki, right? Not to go over them today, but just the three bands being Yokohama and Sapporo, and I'm just somehow spacing out on the one. Kumamoto, which was the second one that we talked about. Really appreciate you taking the time. If you want to share anything else regarding this before we finish up.
No, thank you very much for having me a guest on the podcast, and I hope that it was informative and helpful for the listeners. So.
Yeah, well, thanks, and thanks again for listening. And I really hope to have some more content, historical content like this in the future. Appreciate you coming on. So thanks a lot, everybody, and see you next time.